Dr. Hale? The voice was soft, professional, achingly familiar in a way that made no sense. I'm Dr. Emma Sinclair, your new resident. Marcus turned slowly from the trauma bay sink, blood still coating his fingernails, and his world tilted on its axis. She was everything he'd specifically tried to avoid. 3 years. 3 years since the scandal with Dr. Vanessa Chen, since the ethics investigation that nearly destroyed him, since he'd sworn an oath more binding than his Hippocratic one. Never again. He'd requested a plain resident, someone forgettable, unremarkable, who wouldn't turn heads or disturb the careful equilibrium he'd constructed through isolation and rigid control. Someone safe. The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's emergency department hummed their relentless rhythm. The nurses' station had fallen silent, everyone watching, waiting. Marcus could feel the shift in the air, the held breath of recognition that beauty like hers always commanded. She stood in the doorway, honey-colored eyes meeting his with professional composure that barely masked something deeper. Nervous, guarded, running from something just like he was. And in that moment, Marcus knew his carefully constructed walls were about to come crashing down. The morning sun filtered through the emergency department's wide windows, turning the sterile white walls the color of weak tea. Marcus kept his voice level, clinical, as he walked Emma through the layout. Trauma Bay. 1, 2, 3. Radiology down the left corridor. CT scanner second door on the right. His hands remained clasped behind his back, a deliberate choice, maintaining the careful distance he'd perfected over 3 years. Emma listened with focused attention, her honey-colored eyes tracking each gesture, each landmark. She carried a tablet, fingers moving efficiently across the screen, making notes he couldn't see. The simple act of watching her write made something tighten in his chest. He looked away, gesturing toward the nurse's station. Behind the desk, he could see Nurse Rachel Torres lean toward the new resident, Jake Morrison, whispering something that made the younger man's gaze follow Emma with obvious interest. Marcus felt his jaw clench. He forced it to relax. This was exactly what he'd feared, exactly why he'd requested someone unremarkable. Beautiful women disrupted the careful equilibrium of hospital hierarchy. They created complications, jealousies, distractions that had no place in emergency medicine. The morning rounds began at 7. Marcus led the team through each bay, presenting cases with his usual precision. When he asked for observations on the patient in Bay 2, a 53-year-old man with chest pain, the other residents offered standard assessments. Possible MI. Rule out cardiac event. Emma stepped forward, her voice quiet but certain. The EKG shows subtle ST depression in leads 2, 3, and AVF. Combined with his history of hypertension and the quality of the pain, radiating to the jaw but not the left arm, I'd consider inferior wall involvement. We should also assess for right ventricular infarction. It's frequently missed, but critical for treatment approach. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. The observation was sophisticated, nuanced, exactly what he would have noted himself. He nodded curtly. Good catch. Order a right-sided EKG. The words came out more clipped than intended, a defense against the unwelcome respect rising in his throat. Throughout the morning, he found himself noticing things he had no business noticing. The way Emma tied her surgical mask with practiced efficiency, threading the strings behind her ears in one fluid motion. How she moved through the department with a spatial awareness that spoke of years in chaotic environments, never bumping equipment, never in anyone's way. The calm authority in her voice when she spoke to a terrified elderly woman. Gentle without being condescending. Professional without being cold. He noticed when Jake Morrison found excuses to stand too close to her during procedures. when the cafeteria worker held eye contact a fraction too long, when the attending from cardiology suddenly developed a keen interest in the emergency department's morning rounds. Marcus told himself it wasn't his concern. Emma was a resident under his supervision, nothing more. Her effect on other men was their problem, not his. The trauma came in just after noon. A construction worker fell 3 stories, multiple injuries, pressure dropping fast. Marcus was scrubbing when Emma appeared beside him, already gowned, her movements quick and precise. He didn't acknowledge her beyond a brief nod, turning his attention to the patient being wheeled through the doors. Blood pressure 70/40, heart rate 130, decreased breath sounds on the right. The paramedic's voice was urgent, professional. Marcus's hands moved automatically, checking airway, breathing, circulation. Probable hemothorax. We need a chest tube now. He reached for the equipment, but Emma was already there, passing him the scalpel, then the tube, anticipating each need before he voiced it. Her hands were steady as she held the retractor, adjusting the angle without being asked, giving him the perfect field of view. The procedure took 6 minutes. 6 minutes of synchronized movement, their hands working in parallel rhythms like musicians who'd played together for years instead of hours. When the chest tube drained dark blood and the patient's pressure began to climb, Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction of a life pulled back from the edge. But underneath it was something else, something that made his breath catch behind his surgical mask. Emma stepped back, stripping off her gloves with efficient snaps. Her face was calm, but he could see the slight tremor in her fingers as she disposed of the sharps, the only sign of the adrenaline that had to be coursing through her system. She'd performed flawlessly under pressure, made critical decisions without hesitation, worked beside him as if she could read his mind. It was worse than he'd feared. She wasn't just beautiful, she was brilliant, and he was in serious trouble. Marcus retreated to his office the moment the patient was stabilized, closing the door with more force than necessary. He pulled Emma's transfer file from his desk drawer, spreading the pages across the scarred surface. Impeccable record, top of her class, stellar recommendations from multiple attendings, 3 months at Boston General before requesting transfer here. 3 months. Then nothing. A gap that shouldn't exist. A silence that spoke louder than any evaluation. He stared at the dates, searching for explanations that would justify sending her back, reasons that would make sense on paper. Found nothing but excellence and that unexplained absence. Something had driven her here, to a small hospital in a city where no one knew her name. Something had made her run. Marcus closed the file, pressing his palms against his eyes until colors bloomed in the darkness. He told himself he didn't care about her story, about what shadows she was fleeing. Told himself her past was none of his concern, that all that mattered was her performance in his department. The lie settled in his chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. The first week passed in careful choreography, 2 dancers circling each other without ever quite touching. Marcus posted the resident schedules on Monday morning, assigning Emma to overnight shifts that made the other residents groan with sympathy. Thursday through Sunday, 11 at night until 7 in the morning, the hours when the emergency department transformed into something raw and desperate. She studied the schedule in silence, then nodded once and walked away. No complaints, no questions, just acceptance that felt too practiced to be coincidence. They developed a language during procedures, stripped of everything unnecessary. Scalpel, retractor, clamp. His hands moved and hers followed, or sometimes led, anticipating needs before he voiced them. It was efficient, professional, exactly what he wanted. It also felt like standing too close to a fire, the heat present even when you weren't looking at the flames. Dr. Derek Morrison appeared in the emergency department with increasing frequency, his cardiothoracic cases somehow requiring consultation on patients 3 floors away from his usual domain. He had the easy confidence of a man who'd never been told no, leaning against the nurse's station while Emma reviewed charts, his smile wide and practiced. Marcus watched from his office window, telling himself it was supervisory vigilance, nothing more. Morrison's attention was a complication Emma would need to navigate. That was all. On Tuesday afternoon, Nurse Rachel Torres cornered Emma by the medication dispensary, her voice low, but carrying just enough for Marcus to hear from his position at the nearby computer terminal. "You should know about Dr. Hale." Rachel's tone was kind, but firm. "They call him the Ice King. Brilliant surgeon, saves more lives than anyone in this department, but don't expect warmth. His last relationship ended 3 years ago with an ethics investigation. He's been frozen solid ever since." Emma's response was too quiet to hear, but Marcus saw the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the way her hands went still on the keyboard. Rachel continued, "Just manage your expectations. Some men are married to their work because it's safer than being married to people." Marcus forced his attention back to his screen, the words blurring before his eyes. The warning was fair, even kind. Rachel was protecting a new resident from disappointment, from reading too much into professional interactions. He should be grateful someone was maintaining appropriate boundaries, since he seemed incapable of it. Thursday night, Emma's first overnight shift, Marcus found reasons to stay late. Paperwork that could wait. Charts that needed review. Completely legitimate justifications that had nothing to do with the resident working 3 floors below. When he finally left at midnight, he saw her through the cafeteria windows, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a medical journal. The fluorescent lights cast her features in stark relief, emphasizing the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. She looked as exhausted as he felt, as isolated as he'd been for 3 years. Friday brought a multi-vehicle accident, 7 patients arriving simultaneously, chaos measured in blood pressure and trauma bays. Emma worked alongside him for 6 straight hours, her movements growing more efficient as fatigue set in, as if exhaustion stripped away hesitation and left only instinct. When the last patient was stabilized, when the adrenaline finally faded, Marcus saw her hands shake as she stripped off her gloves. She made fists to stop the tremors, a gesture he recognized from his own mirror. By Sunday, he'd noticed the pattern. Emma arrived an hour before her shift began, stayed an hour after it ended. She never joined the other residents when they gathered at Murphy's bar down the street, never participated in the easy camaraderie that defined hospital culture. During breaks, she sat alone, usually reading, occasionally staring at nothing with an expression that suggested she was somewhere far away, somewhere darker than St. Catherine's fluorescent halls. On Monday night, Marcus needed suture kits from the supply closet. The motion sensor lights flickered on as he entered, illuminating metal shelves stacked with medical supplies. He was reaching for the top shelf when the door opened behind him. Emma stepped inside, her hand already extending toward the same shelf, the same box of suture kits. Their fingers collided in the space between intention and object. The contact was brief, incidental, the kind of accidental touch that happened constantly in the confined spaces of hospital work, except it wasn't. Marcus felt the warmth of her skin like a brand, felt the slight catch in her breathing that matched his own. Time seemed to suspend, stretching the moment into something vast and dangerous. Emma pulled back first, her hand retreating as if burned. "I'm sorry." The apology was unnecessary, automatic, the response of someone who'd learned to apologize for existing in spaces others wanted. "I didn't realize you were here." Marcus's throat felt tight, his voice emerging rougher than intended. It's a supply closet. We're both allowed to be here. He grabbed the suture kit, his movements jerky, uncoordinated in a way that felt foreign to hands trained for surgical precision. He left without looking back, feeling her gaze follow him down the corridor. That night, in his apartment that was still more storage space than home, Marcus lay awake, watching shadows move across the ceiling. His hand rested on the bed beside him, fingers flexing involuntarily, feeling the ghost of her touch like an echo that wouldn't fade. He told himself it meant nothing. Told himself it was exhaustion, stress, the natural response to prolonged isolation finally cracking under pressure. The lie kept him awake until dawn, painted the windows gray. And even then, he couldn't quite convince himself it was true. 3 weeks into Emma's rotation, the routine shattered. The patient was 42, presenting with vague abdominal pain and nausea. Textbook gastroenteritis, the kind of case first-year residents handled in their sleep. Emma ordered fluids, anti-nausea medication, standard protocol. Marcus barely glanced at the chart when she presented it during rounds, his attention already moving to the next bay, the next crisis demanding immediate intervention. 2 hours later, the patient coded. Ruptured ectopic pregnancy, massive internal bleeding, blood pressure crashing before they could get her to surgery. The obstetrics team worked for 40 minutes, cutting open the abdomen right there in Trauma Bay 2, fighting to save a life that was already slipping away through their gloved fingers. Emma stood frozen at the periphery, her face the color of old bone, watching as they called time of death at 14:37. Marcus found her an hour later in the east stairwell, the one residents used when they needed to fall apart, away from patients, and supervising attendings. She sat on the concrete steps, her scrubs still marked with dried blood the color of rust, hands clasped between her knees. Her eyes stared at the gray wall opposite, not blinking, not seeing. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed with a dying bulb's irregular rhythm, casting her face in alternating brightness and shadow. He paused in the doorway, instinct warring with professional distance. Walking away would be safer, easier, maintaining the boundaries he'd worked so hard to construct. Instead, he moved forward, his footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. She didn't look up as he sat beside her, leaving careful inches between them, close enough for presence, far enough for propriety. The silence stretched, measured in heartbeats and shallow breaths. Emma wasn't crying, but Marcus recognized the rigid control in her shoulders, the way she held herself absolutely still, as if movement might shatter whatever dam was holding back the flood. He'd sat this way himself, years ago, knowing that tears were a luxury he couldn't afford, that breaking meant never reassembling the pieces in quite the same configuration. I missed a ruptured ectopic in my second year of residency. The words emerged rough, unpracticed, dragged from a place he kept locked behind professional competence. 28-year-old woman came in with right lower quadrant pain. I was so sure it was appendicitis. Textbook presentation, every symptom aligning perfectly. His hands flexed against his knees, remembering the weight of that certainty. By the time we realized what it actually was, she'd lost too much blood. Died on the table while I watched, unable to do anything except understand how completely I'd failed her. Emma's breathing changed, becoming less controlled, more human. She turned her head slowly, her honey-colored eyes finding his face for the first time. The composure that usually guarded her features had cracked, revealing something raw and wounded beneath. "Does it get easier?" Her voice was barely audible above the buzzing light. "Knowing you missed something. Knowing someone died because you weren't good enough." Marcus held her gaze, refusing to offer comfort that would be a lie. "No. You learn to carry it better. You learn to use it, to make yourself sharper, more careful." but it never stops visiting you. Some nights I still see her face, still run through every moment of that exam, searching for what I should have caught. I didn't come here to fail. Emma's words were quiet, weighted with meaning that extended beyond this single case, this single death. Marcus heard what she wasn't saying, recognized the echo of his own history. She'd run from something, fled to this small hospital in a city where no one knew her name, hoping for a fresh start that would somehow erase whatever had driven her here. And now failure had followed her anyway, proving that geography couldn't outrun your own inadequacy. The stairwell was cold, the concrete leaching heat from their bodies. Neither moved to leave. They sat together in the gray light, two people who understood that some wounds never fully healed, just learned to bleed quieter. An hour later, Marcus stood from the steps, his knees protesting the prolonged sitting. "Come to my office. We need to review the case." It wasn't a request, but his voice lacked its usual clinical edge, softened by shared failure, by the strange intimacy of mutual vulnerability. Emma followed him through the corridors, keeping the careful distance they'd maintained for 3 weeks. In his office, Marcus pulled up the patient's chart on his computer, gesturing to the chair beside his desk. Emma sat close enough that he could smell the antiseptic soap from the scrub room, the coffee that had gone cold hours ago, the human scent beneath the hospital's sterile overlay. He walked her through the case methodically, pointing out the subtle signs she'd missed, the pain that had been too diffuse, too mobile, the vital signs that had been too stable initially, masking the slow bleed. But he also showed her what she'd done right: the thorough physical exam, the appropriate initial orders, the systematic approach that would serve her well in thousands of future cases. His voice was gentler than usual, stripped of the harsh precision he used during teaching rounds. Emma listened intently, asking questions that showed she was processing, learning, transforming tragedy into education the way good doctors had to. When she finally stood to leave, thanking him with words that felt inadequate for what had passed between them, Marcus nodded once. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Marcus sat alone in his office, staring at the empty chair beside his desk, feeling the space where she'd been like a missing tooth, tongue probing the absence. The room felt larger than it had in years, emptier, colder. He told himself it was just the late hour, just exhaustion catching up after a difficult shift. But the lie wouldn't hold, not anymore. The rhythm established itself without discussion, without formal arrangement. Emma requested permanent assignment to overnight shifts, her voice carefully neutral as she explained to the chief resident that she slept better during daylight hours anyway. Marcus never mentioned that he'd been working nights almost exclusively for 2 years, that the darkness suited him, that the 3 a.m. emergency department felt like a territory where normal rules suspended themselves in favor of something more honest. The conversations began in the gaps between traumas, a laceration sutured, waiting for the next ambulance call, a cardiac patient stabilized, transferred upstairs, leaving them alone in the sudden quiet. They discussed cases at first, the safe territory of medicine. Emma challenged his diagnosis of pneumonia in an elderly patient, suggesting instead a pulmonary embolism masked by chronic lung disease. She was right. Marcus found himself arguing back when she proposed conservative management for a head injury he thought needed immediate intervention. Sometimes she convinced him. Sometimes he convinced her. The debates sharpened both their thinking, honing clinical judgment the way a whetstone sharpened steel. Small gestures accumulated like snow, each one insignificant alone, but together building into something with weight and presence. Marcus arrived for his shift one Thursday night, carrying 2 cups of coffee, setting one beside Emma's computer terminal without comment. Black, no sugar. She looked up, surprise flickering across her features before smoothing into something softer. Thank you. How did you know? He shrugged, already turning away, uncomfortable with the gratitude, with the fact that he'd noticed such a small detail about her preferences. You drink it that way in the cafeteria. The following week, Emma left a protein bar on his desk during a particularly brutal shift. 4 traumas back-to-back without pause for food. Marcus found it during a rare moment of quiet, the wrapper still warm from her pocket. He ate it standing at his window, watching her through the glass as she reviewed CT scans with a radiologist, her profile illuminated by the monitor's blue glow. The simple thoughtfulness settled somewhere deep in his chest, a warmth he couldn't quite dismiss as gratitude. Their silent communication during procedures deepened, became almost uncanny. Emma would have the right instrument in hand before Marcus asked, adjusting suction angles without prompting, moving in synchronization that felt more like dance than medicine. Other residents noticed, whispered about it in the break room. Even Rachel Torres commented one night, as Marcus charted notes at the nurse's station. Dr. Sinclair is different around you. Softer somehow. Less guarded. Marcus kept his eyes on his computer screen, fingers continuing their steady typing. She's an excellent resident, that's all. Rachel's knowing look burned against his profile, but she said nothing more, leaving him with the observation that burrowed under his skin like a splinter, impossible to ignore, impossible to remove. Dr. Derek Morrison's attention intensified, his flirtations becoming more persistent, more physical. Marcus watched from his office as Morrison cornered Emma by the medication dispensary, standing too close, his hand touching her elbow, her shoulder, lingering in ways that made Marcus's jaw clench. Emma handled it with professional courtesy, stepping back, creating distance, never quite rejecting Morrison overtly enough to create conflict. But Marcus saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her smile never reached her eyes. The mass casualty event came on a Friday night, 11:37. A tour bus versus semi-truck on the interstate, 23 patients incoming, conditions ranging from minor to critical. The emergency department transformed into controlled chaos, every bay filled, residents running between cases, attending physicians directing traffic with urgent calm. Marcus and Emma worked side by side for 14 hours straight. Their communication stripped down to essentials, hands moving in practiced synchronization, anticipating needs before they materialized. Scalpel, retractor, suture, blood pressure dropping, push epinephrine, start another line. The patients blurred together into a continuous stream of broken bodies requiring immediate intervention, life or death decisions made in seconds, success measured in heartbeats maintained, blood pressures stabilized, airways secured. When the last patient was finally transferred upstairs, when the trauma bays stood empty except for the debris of emergency medicine, Marcus and Emma walked together to the ambulance bay. Dawn was breaking over the city, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber. They sat on the concrete loading dock, legs dangling, both too exhausted for pretense, for the careful distance they usually maintained. The silence between them felt different now, weighted with shared experience, with the intimacy of perfect partnership under impossible pressure. Emma's head began to drift sideways, gravitating toward Marcus's shoulder as exhaustion pulled at her control. He felt the motion more than saw it, felt the warmth of her approaching body, the magnetic pull of simple human contact after hours of intense isolation, despite working surrounded by people. She caught herself, pulled back, straightened her spine. I'm sorry. Exhaustion makes me. Marcus stared straight ahead at the emerging sunrise, his heart racing despite the stillness of his body, despite the careful neutrality of his expression. Don't apologize. We all need something to lean on sometimes." But she didn't lean again, and he didn't invite it, and they sat together in the growing light, close enough to feel each other's warmth, but separated by inches that felt like miles, by fears that felt like walls, by the terrible knowledge that what they were becoming to each other was far more dangerous than either wanted to admit. 2 months into Emma's rotation, death arrived with the cruel randomness that defined emergency medicine. The patient was 17, a high school senior who'd taken what he thought was a painkiller at a party. Fentanyl-laced counterfeit, his heart stopping before the ambulance reached the hospital. They worked for 43 minutes, pushing drugs, shocking his chest, Marcus's hands performing compressions with metronomic precision, while Emma managed the airway with steady competence. Time of death, 22:17. Marcus's voice was flat, professional, giving no indication of the fury burning beneath his ribs. Senseless. Preventable. A life ended before it truly began. Another statistic in an epidemic that consumed children with industrial efficiency. Emma stripped off her gloves with mechanical movements, her face composed, her voice steady as she spoke to the nurse about notifying the family. But Marcus saw what others missed. The tremor in her fingers as she disposed of the sharps. The way she blinked too rapidly, fighting something behind her eyes. The careful control that spoke of emotions held at bay through sheer force of will. She walked toward the stairwell, her stride measured, unhurried. Marcus followed, maintaining enough distance to preserve plausible deniability, to pretend he wasn't tracking her movement through the department like a concerned parent watching a child near deep water. The stairwell door closed behind her. He waited 30 seconds, then pushed through, following the sound of footsteps climbing upward, always upward, toward the roof. He found her at the railing, 10 stories above the city, her hands gripping the metal barrier with enough force to blanch her knuckles white. The night air was cool, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen, the distant sound of traffic like a river flowing through concrete channels. Marcus moved to stand beside her, close enough to be present, far enough to allow escape if she needed it. Minutes passed. The city lights spread below them like fallen stars, indifferent to the small tragedies played out in hospital rooms, in ambulances, in the spaces between heartbeats. Emma's breathing was carefully controlled, each inhalation deliberate, each exhalation measured. Marcus recognized the pattern, the way you breathed when crying would be a luxury you couldn't afford, when breaking meant never quite fitting the pieces back together correctly. Dr. James Whitmore was chief of surgery at Boston General. Emma's voice emerged distant, detached, as if she were narrating events that happened to someone else, in some other life. He mentored me during my first year of residency, called me talented, promising, made me feel special in a place where most residents were invisible, interchangeable. She paused, her grip tightening on the railing. His attention changed, became more personal, his hand on my shoulder during rounds, lingering too long. Private meetings in his office where he'd stand too close. Compliments about my appearance disguised as professional observations. Offers of better rotations, better cases, career advancement, all wrapped in implications I pretended not to understand. The words came faster now, pressure building behind a dam too long maintained. When I refused his advances outright, when I made it clear I wasn't interested in anything beyond professional mentorship, everything changed. He criticized me publicly during rounds, assigned me impossible schedules, back-to-back 30-hour shifts that violated regulations, filed complaints about my performance, my attitude, my competence. Every day became a battle just to survive. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest, recognition of a pattern he'd seen before, of power wielded as weapon, of reputations destroyed by those who held the keys to careers and futures. I reported him to the ethics board. Emma's laugh was bitter, sharp as broken glass. He had 30 years of stellar reputation, relationships with hospital administrators, connections to medical schools across the country. I had accusations. Complaints from a resident everyone suddenly remembered as difficult, emotional, unstable. The investigation cleared him completely. Suggested I seek counseling for stress management, for my apparent inability to handle constructive criticism. She turned to look at Marcus for the first time, her eyes holding depths of pain he recognized from his own mirror. So I ran. Took the first transfer I could find, buried myself at a hospital small enough that his influence wouldn't reach, where no one would know my name or my story. I thought if I could just work hard enough, be good enough, I could prove I wasn't what they said I was. Marcus's throat felt tight, words lodged behind professional distance, behind walls he'd built to protect himself from exactly this kind of connection. Dr. Vanessa Chen was an attending in emergency medicine 3 years ago. His voice emerged rough, unpracticed at confession. We worked together, respected each other's clinical judgment. The relationship that developed felt mutual, consensual, adults making choices. He stared at the city below, seeing instead the interrogation room, the ethics board, the faces that had judged him. When it ended, when she realized I wasn't going to leave my position or marry her or provide whatever future she'd imagined, she filed complaints, claimed I'd used my position to coerce her, that she'd felt pressured to maintain the relationship to protect her career. The investigation technically cleared me, found insufficient evidence of coercion. But the whispers never stopped. Every interaction with female staff became suspect, every professional relationship viewed through lenses of suspicion. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades that promised rain later, painting their faces in soft light that seemed too gentle for the confessions being offered. Emma studied him with an intensity that made him want to look away, to retreat behind the professional distance that had protected him for so long. I'm not her. Emma's words were quiet, certain, holding a weight that demanded acknowledgement. Marcus met her gaze, seeing her clearly for the first time, without the filter of fear, without the protective assumption that beauty meant danger, that connection meant destruction. I know. But the fear remained between them, unspoken, heavy as the dawn air. Two people marked by similar scars, finally seeing each other with terrible clarity, understanding that what they were becoming to each other was exactly what they'd both sworn to avoid. Marcus submitted the reassignment request before his shift ended, typing the justification with clinical precision. Dr. Sinclair would benefit from exposure to diverse teaching methodologies. I have monopolized her training focus for the initial rotation period. Recommend transfer to Dr. Patterson's service for broader educational experience. The words were professionally appropriate, carefully neutral, giving no indication of the truth beneath them. That he'd spent the previous night awake, feeling the ghost of confessions shared on a rooftop, understanding with terrible clarity that he was falling toward something that would destroy them both. The chief resident reviewed the request with skeptical eyes, her gaze sharp as she looked up from the computer screen. Dr. Sinclair is performing exceptionally under your supervision. Her evaluations are the strongest I've seen in years. You're sure about this? Marcus kept his expression neutral, his voice steady. I'm sure. It's in her best interest. The approval came through by noon. Emma was informed during afternoon rounds, her face carefully blank, as the chief resident explained the rotation change effective immediately. She would report to Dr. Patterson starting the next shift. Emma nodded once, her honey-colored eyes never finding Marcus across the trauma bay, never asking the question her rigid posture screamed. Why? Marcus told himself it was the right decision. The only decision. They had opened doors that needed to stay closed, shared vulnerabilities that created dangerous intimacy. Better to retreat now, before feelings deepened into something that would replicate past disasters, that would end in ethics investigations and destroyed careers and the particular kind of loneliness that came from being professionally exiled. 2 weeks passed in careful choreography. They orbited each other in the emergency department's confined space, professionally cordial when circumstances forced interaction, personally distant in ways that felt more extreme than their initial wariness. "Good morning, Dr. Hale." "Good morning, Dr. Sinclair. Can you review this CT?" "Of course." Their conversations stripped down to clinical necessities, voices carefully modulated, eyes never quite meeting. Marcus threw himself into work with renewed intensity, volunteering for extra shifts, taking the cases other attendings avoided. The surgical complications no one wanted, the violent patients requiring security presence, the ethical nightmares where every choice led to someone suffering. Emma did the same, her schedule becoming even more punishing than before, her presence in the hospital nearly constant, as if she too was trying to outrun something that followed, regardless of hours worked or miles traveled. But St. Catherine's emergency department wasn't large enough for true avoidance. They passed in hallways, their shoulders nearly brushing in the narrow corridors. They scrubbed in for procedures in adjacent bays, hearing each other's voices through thin walls, the familiar rhythm of their communication now directed at other residents, other attendings. Each encounter was a fresh wound, superficial, but accumulating, death by 1,000 small cuts. The other residents noticed, whispered in the break room about the sudden cold front between Dr. Hale and Dr. Sinclair, speculated about what had happened, what boundary had been crossed or considered. Rachel Torres watched them both with knowing eyes but said nothing, her silence somehow louder than gossip. The trauma came in during a shift change, the worst possible timing. Multiple gunshot wounds, pressure dropping, bleeding from sites the paramedics couldn't control. Dr. Patterson was in surgery, Dr. Chen was on vacation. Marcus was the only attending available, and Emma was still technically on duty, her shift not officially ended for another 7 minutes. They moved into the trauma bay without discussion, without hesitation, falling into the rhythm they'd developed over 2 months of working side by side. Marcus's hands opened the chest while Emma managed the airway, her fingers adjusting the tube with perfect precision. He called for instruments before she could offer them. She anticipated his needs before he voiced them. Their bodies moved in synchronization that transcended training, that spoke of something deeper than professional competence. The patient's heart had been nicked by a bullet fragment. Marcus worked with focused intensity, his sutures precise despite the urgency, despite the blood obscuring his field of vision. Emma maintained perfect visualization, her hand steady as she held retractors at exactly the right angle, adjusted suction before pooling blood could obscure critical structures. 23 minutes of surgical ballet, every movement coordinated, every decision made in wordless agreement. When the patient's pressure stabilized, when the heart began beating with strong, regular rhythm, when death retreated to wait for another day, they stood across from each other in the trauma bay. Both still masked, both breathing hard behind surgical barriers, both unable to deny what had just passed between them. Perfect synchronization. Complete trust. The kind of partnership that took years to develop, that required a connection deeper than technique, that proved beyond doubt what they'd been trying so desperately to ignore. Emma stripped off her gloves, her movements mechanical, automatic. She left without speaking, without looking back, her stride measured and controlled until she disappeared through the double doors. Marcus stood alone, surrounded by blood-soaked gauze and the detritus of emergency surgery, feeling more isolated than he had in 3 years. The trauma bay was warm from exertion, from the heat of bodies working under pressure, but cold settled in his chest like winter, spreading through his ribs, making it hard to breathe. He'd tried to run. They'd both tried to run. But some things couldn't be outpaced, couldn't be denied, couldn't be contained by professional boundaries or self-protective fear. The truth was simple, terrible, unavoidable. What existed between them was already too powerful to control, too real to dismiss, too dangerous to survive intact. The storm descended on the city like divine retribution, 2 feet of snow in 6 hours, winds howling at 70 miles per hour, temperatures plunging to levels the infrastructure wasn't designed to handle. The emergency department received the first alert at 1800 hours. All staff to remain on duty. All elective procedures canceled. Prepare for mass casualties. The storm passed during the early morning hours, leaving the city buried beneath snow that glittered like crushed diamonds in the emerging sunlight. By noon, the main power was restored, the emergency generators finally silenced, the emergency department slowly transitioning from crisis mode back to controlled chaos. The patients from the overflow wing were transferred to proper rooms. Equipment was restocked. Staff who'd worked 36 hours straight were finally released to go home, to sleep, to pretend normalcy still existed. Marcus and Emma were summoned to the chief's office at 1400 hours. Dr. Patricia Montgomery sat behind her desk, her expression serious but not disapproving, her eyes sharp as they assessed the 2 physicians standing before her with careful distance between them. "I've reviewed the incident reports from last night." Dr. Montgomery's voice carried the weight of administrative authority tempered by clinical respect. "What you 2 accomplished in that overflow wing with minimal resources and no backup was remarkable. 14 patients, all survived, several who shouldn't have by any reasonable standard." She paused, letting the words settle. "You make an exceptional team." Marcus kept his expression neutral, his hands clasped behind his back, aware of Emma beside him maintaining similar rigid composure. "Thank you, Chief. We did what was necessary." Dr. Montgomery leaned forward, her fingers steepled on the desk. "I'm considering making your partnership official. Dr. Sinclair, reassigning you permanently to Dr. Hale's service. Your clinical synchronization is extraordinary. It would be a waste to separate that kind of natural collaboration." Neither Marcus nor Emma responded immediately. The silence stretched, weighted with implications that went far beyond scheduling and educational rotations. Finally, Marcus managed words that felt inadequate. "We appreciate the confidence. Can we have time to consider?" "Of course." Dr. Montgomery's eyes held knowledge that made Marcus uncomfortable, as if she saw more than he wanted visible. "Let me know by end of week." They walked out together, their footsteps echoing in the administrative corridor, neither speaking, neither acknowledging the chief's words or their implications. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. They stepped inside, alone in the confined space as the doors slid closed with mechanical finality. The tension that had been building for months felt thick enough to choke on, heavy as the air before lightning strikes. Emma stood close enough that Marcus could smell the antiseptic soap from her most recent hand-washing, the coffee she'd consumed hours ago, the human scent beneath hospital sterility. Her shoulder brushed his arm, contact that could have been accidental but felt deliberate, intentional, a question asked in the only language they seemed capable of speaking. Marcus's hand flexed at his side, fingers curling into a fist, then releasing, wanting desperately to reach for her, to close the inches between them, to stop pretending that professional distance was anything but a lie they told themselves. The elevator seemed to slow, its descent stretching into eternity, each floor an age, each second expanding to hold more weight than time should carry. The doors opened on the ground floor. Dr. Derek Morrison stood waiting, his expression brightening when he saw Emma, immediately stepping forward in a way that inserted himself between them, breaking whatever moment had been building. "Emma, I was hoping to catch you." His smile was confident, practiced, the expression of a man who'd never been rejected. "Have dinner with me tonight. You've been working yourself to death. Let me feed you something that isn't cafeteria food." Emma hesitated, her body still angled toward Marcus, her eyes finding his face with an expression that asked a question he couldn't answer. Marcus forced his features into neutrality, gave her nothing, no indication of the turmoil churning in his chest. She could make her own choices. Should make her own choices. He had no right to influence them, no claim on her time or attention beyond professional supervision. "That sounds nice." Emma's voice was carefully modulated, revealing nothing. "What time?" Marcus watched them make arrangements, Morrison's hand touching Emma's elbow with casual presumption. Emma not pulling away, but not leaning in either. Something died in Marcus's chest. Something that had been struggling toward life despite his best efforts to suffocate it. He walked past them without a word, his stride measured, controlled, giving no indication that his world was fracturing along fault lines he'd tried so hard to reinforce. That night, Marcus sat in his apartment, the space he'd barely transformed from temporary lodging into anything resembling a home. The furniture was functional but impersonal. The walls were bare. The kitchen held coffee and protein bars and little else. 3 years of living somewhere without actually inhabiting it, of existing in spaces without claiming them, without allowing himself to want anything beyond survival and professional competence. His phone lay on the coffee table, Emma's contact information from the hospital directory displayed on the screen. He'd typed a message 3 times. "We should talk about the chief's offer." Deleted it. "We need to discuss our working relationship." Deleted it. "I can't stop thinking about you." Deleted it fastest of all. Finally, he typed, "We should talk." Stared at the 4 words for 20 minutes, his thumb hovering over the send button, his heart hammering against his ribs like something caged. Deleted it. Poured whiskey he had no intention of drinking. Watched the city lights blur through windows that needed curtains, through eyes that burned with exhaustion and something more dangerous than fatigue. At 2 a.m, Marcus gave up pretending sleep would come. He drove back to St. Catherine's, his car navigating snow-packed streets on autopilot, while his mind circled the same thoughts endlessly. The hospital was quiet. The night shift settled into its rhythm. His office was dark. He didn't turn on the lights, just sat in his chair, staring at nothing, wondering when his life had become this small, this constrained, this unbearable. The knock was soft, hesitant. The door opened before he could respond. Emma stood silhouetted in the hallway light, still in street clothes, her coat dusted with snow. "I couldn't sleep. Neither could I." Marcus's voice was rough, unused for hours. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, the darkness enveloping them both. They stood on opposite sides of his desk, everything they weren't saying filling the space between them with weight and presence and terrible honesty. Emma took 1 step forward. Marcus took 1 step back. "I can't." The words emerged broken, desperate. "We can't do this." "I know." Emma's reply was equally quiet, equally certain, equally false, but neither left. Neither moved toward the door. They stood in the darkness, separated by a desk and fear, and the terrible knowledge that what they were denying was stronger than either of them, more real than professional boundaries, more dangerous than anything they'd survived before. By 1930, The trauma bays were full. Hypothermia cases flooded in, homeless individuals pulled from doorways where they'd sought shelter, elderly patients whose heating had failed, children inadequately dressed for the sudden Arctic blast. Car accidents followed as the roads became skating rinks, vehicles losing control, colliding with brutal physics, bringing the broken and bleeding to St. Catherine's doors in endless succession. Marcus worked without pause, moving from bay to bay, making rapid assessments, prioritizing resources that were already stretched thin. Across the department, he saw Emma doing the same, her movements efficient, her voice calm as she directed nurses, reassured terrified patients, made life-or-death decisions with the certainty that came from excellent training and natural aptitude. At 2300, the main power failed. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in red, transforming the emergency department into something from a fever dream. The backup generators struggled, their capacity insufficient for the load demanded. Critical equipment only. Ventilators. Monitors. The rest would have to be managed manually. The chief of medicine made the decision quickly. We're opening the overflow wing. Old patient rooms from before the renovation, minimal equipment, but we need the space. Dr. Hale, Dr. Sinclair, you'll staff it. We can spare 2 nurses. Do what you can. The overflow wing was cold, the heating system inadequate, the lighting sporadic. They had 12 patients, ranging from stable hypothermia to critical trauma, and resources that wouldn't have been sufficient for half that number. Marcus and Emma fell into their natural rhythm without discussion, without the careful distance they'd maintained for 2 weeks. Necessity overrode fear, survival instinct stronger than self-protection. The night stretched into an endless battle against chaos and inadequacy. They manually ventilated patients when the single portable ventilator couldn't be shared fast enough. Performed procedures by flashlight, Emma holding, the beam steady, while Marcus's hands worked with practiced precision in the narrow circle of illumination. Triaged in near darkness, making decisions based on touch and sound and clinical instinct developed through years of training. Hour 15 arrived without Marcus noticing the passage of time. His body moved on autopilot, exhaustion a background hum he'd learned to ignore during residency, during the brutal years of learning to be a surgeon. Beside him, Emma worked with the same determined endurance, her face pale in the red emergency lighting, her hands steady despite the cold that had seeped into the unheated wing. A brief lull came around 4 a.m. The patients were stable for the moment, the nurses taking vital signs, the crisis temporarily contained. Marcus leaned against the wall, his legs suddenly unreliable, his body demanding rest it couldn't have. Emma collapsed beside him, their shoulders touching in the narrow hallway, too exhausted for the careful distance that had defined the past weeks. Her head tilted, found his shoulder, rested there with a weight that felt both foreign and perfectly natural. Marcus didn't pull away. His hand moved of its own volition, finding hers in the darkness, their fingers interlacing with the same natural precision their surgical work had always demonstrated. They sat like that for 10 minutes, not speaking, just breathing together, sharing warmth in the cold hallway, sharing presence in the isolation of crisis. The alarm shattered the moment. Patient in room 4, cardiac arrest. They were moving before conscious thought, their bodies responding to years of training, to the imperative that superseded exhaustion, cold, fear. The patient was crashing hard, pressure dropping, heart rhythm deteriorating into chaos. No time for the crash cart. Marcus made the decision in seconds. "We're doing it here. Emma, I need light." She grabbed the flashlight, her hands rock steady despite the impossibility of what he was asking. Emergency thoracotomy in a hallway with inadequate equipment, with only flashlight illumination, with no backup if things went wrong. Marcus's scalpel opened the chest with practiced efficiency. Emma held the light exactly where he needed it, anticipating his movements, shifting the beam before he could ask. Her voice remained calm as she called out vitals from the portable monitor. Pressure 60/40, heart rate dropping. No palpable pulse. His hands found the heart, felt the weak fluttering that meant seconds remaining before complete failure. Squeezed, released, squeezed. Manual cardiac massage, his fingers literally holding life in his palms. Emma adjusted the light, her breathing steady, her presence an anchor in the chaos. One of the nurses pushed medications while the other maintained the airway. 5 minutes. 10. Marcus's hands cramping, his arms burning, his entire world narrowed to the rhythm of compression and release, to the stubborn insistence that this patient would not die. Not here. Not now. Not after everything they'd survived this night. The heart shuddered, contracted, beat once, twice, found its own rhythm. Pressure climbing, the monitor showing organized electrical activity instead of chaos. Marcus stepped back, his hands shaking now that the crisis had passed, now that adrenaline was fading into exhaustion. Emma lowered the flashlight, and in the red emergency lighting, their eyes met across the patient's body. Something passed between them in that moment, something that transcended words, that spoke of trust absolute and partnership complete. They weren't just colleagues anymore, weren't just two people carefully maintaining professional distance while fighting attraction. They were partners in every sense that mattered. Had been from the beginning, perhaps, but now the truth was undeniable, proven in blood and darkness and the shared triumph of a life saved against impossible odds. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The patient's steady heartbeat said everything that mattered. Dr. James Whitmore arrived at St. Catherine's on a Tuesday morning, his reputation preceding him like a herald announcing royalty. Chief of surgery at Boston General, published researcher, teaching awards spanning 3 decades. The administration had arranged his 2-week observational visit months in advance, eager to learn from one of the country's premier trauma programs, of color, hoping his assessment might lead to accreditation as if physically struck, prestige that came from association pressing against the wall behind her with enough force Marcus to leave was reviewing patient charts at the reaction lasted perhaps 3 seconds before she watched her face drain, before her professional mask slammed into place with the desperate control of someone who'd learned to hide terror behind competence. But Marcus had seen, had witnessed the fear flash across her features before she could suppress it, raw and visceral and utterly unmistakable. Something cold settled in his chest, protective instinct rising before conscious thought could moderate it. That evening, he found Emma in the resident workroom, hands shaking as she reviewed charts, her fingers trembling against the computer mouse hard enough to make the cursor jitter across the screen. She wouldn't meet his eyes when he approached, her attention fixed on the monitor with false intensity. "What's wrong?" Marcus kept his voice low, aware of other residents within hearing distance. "Nothing. I'm fine." The lie was transparent, obvious, insulting to them both. "Don't lie to me." The words came out harsher than intended, edged with fear for her that he couldn't quite suppress, couldn't quite rationalize as merely supervisory concern. Emma's hands stilled on the keyboard. "He's here. Dr. Whitmore." The chief assigned him to co-supervise several of my cases. Standard protocol for visiting attendings. Educational opportunity. Her voice was flat, affectless, the tone of someone reciting facts to avoid feeling them. Marcus felt something fierce ignite in his chest, protective fury he'd been trying to suppress for months, suddenly given permission to exist, to burn. How many cases? 3 scheduled so far. maybe more depending on his interests. She finally looked at him, her honey-colored eyes holding depths of terror she was fighting to contain through sheer force of will. "I can handle it. I have to handle it." Over the following days, Marcus watched Whitmore with predator's attention, studying the older surgeon's movements, his interactions, the subtle power dynamics that played out beneath professional courtesy. Whitmore was charismatic, commanding respect without demanding it, his clinical skills impressive, his teaching style engaging. Residents competed for his attention. Nurses smiled when he entered rooms. The administration treated him like visiting nobility. But Marcus saw what others missed. The way Whitmore's gaze followed Emma through the department, possessive and evaluating. How he stood too close during case presentations, his hand touching her shoulder, her back, contact that lasted fractions of seconds too long. The professional compliments that carried undertones of ownership, of assessment. "You're doing well, Dr. Sinclair," maintaining standards despite the change in environment. The words seemed kind, but Marcus heard the implication beneath them. The suggestion that her competence was temporary, conditional, something that could be revoked. Marcus began inserting himself into Emma's cases, finding reasons to be present when Whitmore was supervising. Needed to observe this particular procedure. Wanted to assess resident performance under diverse teaching styles. The excuses were thin, transparent, but no one challenged an attending physician's presence in his own department. The other residents noticed, whispered about Dr. Hale's sudden interest in cases he'd previously delegated. The gossip intensified, speculation about what was happening between the Ice King and the beautiful new resident who'd somehow thawed him. Whitmore noticed, too. His eyes would find Marcus across the trauma bay, calculating, assessing, the look of a chess player recognizing an unexpected opponent. He said nothing directly, maintained perfect professional courtesy, but Marcus felt the challenge in those glances, the unspoken acknowledgement of territorial dispute. On Thursday afternoon, Marcus was reviewing radiology results when instinct made him look up, made him scan the department with sudden urgency he couldn't explain. Emma had been heading toward the supply closet. Whitmore had followed seconds later. Marcus moved without conscious decision, his body responding to alarm his mind hadn't yet articulated. He reached the supply closet as Whitmore's voice drifted through the partially open door, soft, almost kind, more devastating than shouting. "You can't hide from what you are, Emma. You'll never be more than a pretty face playing doctor. You know it. I know it. That's why you ran. Because deep down, you understand you don't belong here. That your competence is temporary, contingent on men like me being willing to overlook your fundamental inadequacy." Marcus pushed the door fully open. "Step away from her." The words emerged quiet, deadly, carrying weight that made Whitmore's head turn, made his expression shift from false kindness to something calculating, amused. "Dr. Hale." Whitmore's smile was practiced, professional, revealing nothing. Just having a mentoring conversation with Dr. Sinclair, sharing some wisdom from my years of experience. He backed toward the door, his movements unhurried, confident. "I'm sure you understand the value of honest feedback in medical education." He left, closing the door behind him, leaving poison in the air, leaving Emma pressed against the supply shelves with her arms wrapped around herself, holding broken pieces together through sheer determination. Marcus watched her composure fracture, watched the professional mask finally crack, watched 3 months of accumulated pressure find release in shaking that started in her hands and spread through her entire body. He crossed to her without thinking, without calculating consequences or considering who might see. Pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with fierce protectiveness, holding her while she shook, while silent sobs racked her frame, while years of suppressed trauma finally found voice in gasping breaths against his shoulder. "I've got you." The words were inadequate, insufficient, but they were all he had. "You're safe. I've got you." Emma clung to him, her fingers gripping his white coat with desperate strength, her face buried against his chest. They stood like that for long minutes, no longer caring who might see, no longer pretending professional distance was anything but a lie they'd been telling themselves. The wolf had arrived, and Marcus would burn his career to ash before he'd let Whitmore destroy Emma the way he'd tried before. The complaint arrived on Dr. Montgomery's desk Friday morning, formal and devastating in its clinical precision. Dr. James Whitmore alleged that Dr. Marcus Hale was demonstrating inappropriate favoritism toward Dr. Emma Sinclair, creating a hostile educational environment for other residents, showing preferential treatment that suggested personal rather than professional interest. Given Dr. Hale's documented history with Dr. Vanessa Chen and the previous ethics investigation, the complaint required immediate formal review. Hospital policy was unambiguous. Past behavior predicted future patterns. Accusations demanded investigation. Marcus received the summons Monday afternoon. Report to Conference Room 3 at 1500 hours. Bring no materials. Come alone. He knew what it meant before he walked through the door, recognized the setup from 3 years ago. The hospital attorney sat beside an external investigator, their expressions professionally neutral, their questions carefully constructed to elicit truth, whether or not he wanted to provide it. "Is your relationship with Dr. Sinclair romantic in nature?" The investigator's pen hovered over her notepad, waiting. "No." Marcus kept his voice steady, his hands relaxed on the conference table despite the tension coiling through his shoulders. "Has there been any physical contact beyond what would be considered professionally appropriate?" "No." The lie of omission burned. Holding her while she cried wasn't romantic, wasn't inappropriate, was human compassion in response to witnessed trauma. "Have you made any promises to her regarding her career, her evaluations, her future at this hospital?" "No." The truth this time? Unambiguous. The investigator set down her pen, her eyes sharp as they studied his face. "But you have feelings for her." It wasn't a question. Marcus couldn't lie, couldn't force the denial past his throat. The silence was answer enough. The investigator sighed, a sound heavy with resignation and something that might have been sympathy. "Dr. Hale, I need you to understand the position you're in. Given your history, given Dr. Whitmore's complaint, you need to distance yourself from Dr. Sinclair immediately, completely, or this ends badly for both of you. Not a threat. A statement of institutional reality, of how power protected itself, of how history repeated because people never learned from it. Emma's interview happened simultaneously in a different conference room. Different investigator, same questions, same careful construction designed to reveal truth. Has Dr. Hale pressured you in any way? Made unwanted advances? Used his position to create expectations beyond professional supervision? No. Emma's defense was fierce, immediate, perhaps too passionate. Dr. Hale has been nothing but professional. He's an excellent teacher, a brilliant surgeon, and anyone suggesting otherwise is lying. The investigator made notes, her expression unreadable. "Dr. Sinclair, I'm here to help you. If something inappropriate is happening, you can tell me. You're protected by hospital policy." She paused, letting the implication settle. "There's a pattern here that concerns me. Your complaint against Dr. Whitmore in Boston. Now this situation with Dr. Hale." Emma felt the floor tilt beneath her chair, felt the walls closing in with suffocating pressure. "You think I'm the problem. You think I'm pursuing attending physicians and then crying harassment when it doesn't work out. I think patterns exist for reasons." The investigator's voice was gentle, which made it worse. I think young, attractive female residents sometimes face unique challenges, and sometimes they create unique challenges. History was repeating, inverted like a photograph's negative. Emma was being painted as the aggressor, the unstable woman who used beauty as weapon, who manufactured drama where none existed, the victim becoming the perpetrator through the simple alchemy of institutional suspicion and gendered assumptions about who held power and who wielded it inappropriately. That night, Marcus found Emma sitting in her car in the parking garage, engine off, keys in her lap, staring through the windshield at concrete walls that offered no answers. He opened the passenger door, slid into the seat without asking permission, without offering explanation for how he'd known to look for her here. They sat in silence, the car cold around them, their breath fogging the windows until the outside world became obscured, until they existed in a bubble separate from hospital politics and investigations, and the machinery of institutional protection grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. "I'll request a transfer." Emma's voice was flat, defeated. "To another hospital. Different city. It's the only way to stop this, to protect you." "No." Marcus turned to face her, his expression fierce in the parking garage's dim lighting. "We've done nothing wrong. Nothing. We won't run from this. Not this time. Running is all I know how to do." Emma's hands twisted in her lap. "And you've already run once. We're good at it. Then we'll be bad at it." Marcus's voice carried conviction he wasn't sure he felt but needed her to hear. "We'll stay. We'll fight. We'll tell the truth, and trust that truth matters." Truth didn't matter in Boston. Emma's bitterness was sharp, earned. Then we'll make it matter here. The next morning, Marcus requested a meeting with Dr. Montgomery, walked into her office without the armor of careful phrasing or strategic omission, laid out everything: Whitmore's history with Emma in Boston, the harassment Emma had reported, the ethics investigation that cleared Whitmore while destroying Emma's reputation, the current behavior Marcus had witnessed, the supply closet conversation, the manipulative complaint designed to silence anyone who might challenge Whitmore's carefully constructed image. Dr. Montgomery listened, her expression unreadable, her hands folded on her desk. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Even if everything you're saying is true, Marcus, and I'm not saying I disbelieve you, you're compromised. You have feelings for Dr. Sinclair. That makes you an unreliable witness. Your judgment regarding her is clouded by personal attachment. I'm telling you what I saw, what I heard." Marcus kept his voice level despite the fury building in his chest. "You're telling me what you interpreted through the lens of protective feelings for a woman you care about." Dr. Montgomery's tone was gentle, which somehow made it more devastating. "I can't ignore Dr. Whitmore's complaint. I can't overlook your history. I have to protect this hospital, these residents, from liability." "So you'll protect Whitmore. Protect the man with power and reputation." Marcus heard the bitterness in his own voice, couldn't moderate it. "I'm protecting everyone by removing the appearance of impropriety." Dr. Montgomery's decision was already made, visible in the set of her shoulders, the finality in her eyes. "I'm suspending you both from working together, effective immediately. Pending investigation. Dr. Sinclair will be reassigned. You will have no supervisory contact. This is not negotiable." Marcus walked out knowing he'd lost, knowing that truth mattered less than institutional liability, knowing that some battles couldn't be won through honesty alone. Emma was reassigned to day shift under Dr. Patterson's supervision, her schedule restructured to minimize any possibility of overlap with Marcus's nights. The chief resident delivered the news with professional neutrality, her eyes revealing nothing about what she thought of the investigation, the allegations, the careful dismantling of the department's most effective teaching partnership. They passed each other during shift changes now, their paths crossing in hallways and elevators with the awkward choreography of forced avoidance. "Good evening, Dr. Sinclair. Good morning, Dr. Hale." Professional nods, voices carefully modulated, eyes never quite meeting. The distance was agony, more painful than Marcus had anticipated, more devastating than seemed rational given they'd maintained careful boundaries throughout their months of working together. He'd survived 3 years of isolation before Emma arrived. 3 years of emotional winter, of walls built high enough to keep everyone out, of deliberate loneliness chosen over the risk of connection. But 2 weeks without her felt unbearable, each day stretching into endless hours, each night shift devoid of the conversations that had made darkness tolerable, had made the 3 a.m. emergency department feel less like exile and more like sanctuary. He saw her occasionally in the cafeteria during the brief overlap between his night ending and her day beginning. She always sat alone, that guarded expression back in place. The walls he'd watched her lower brick by brick now rebuilt higher than before. Her coffee sat untouched beside her, growing cold while she stared at medical journals she wasn't reading, her attention focused inward on thoughts Marcus could only imagine. Dr. Derek Morrison had renewed his pursuit with aggressive enthusiasm, taking advantage of Marcus's enforced absence to insert himself into the space left vacant. Marcus watched from across the cafeteria as Morrison sat at Emma's table uninvited, his body language confident, proprietary. Watched as Morrison said something that made Emma laugh, the sound carrying across the room, stabbing Marcus with jealousy so intense it felt physical, burned in his chest like swallowed acid. The investigation continued with bureaucratic thoroughness. More interviews, more questions, more scrutiny of every interaction Marcus and Emma had shared over 3 months. The hospital. Grapevine churned with speculation, gossip spreading through break rooms and nurses' stations with the efficiency of viral transmission. Some staff believed Marcus was being unfairly targeted again, victimized by an institution too concerned with liability to defend good physicians. Others thought he was a predator who'd never learned his lesson, whose pattern of inappropriate relationships with female colleagues proved he shouldn't be trusted with supervisory authority. Emma became the subject of cruel gossip, whispers that followed her through the department like shadows. She's a troublemaker, uses her looks to cause problems, probably slept her way through medical school, should never have been hired. Marcus heard the comments, saw the sideways glances, watched as colleagues who'd respected Emma's clinical skills now questioned every diagnosis, second-guessed every decision, treated her competence as suspect because her beauty made everything about her suspect. He saw Emma withdrawing deeper each day, the light dimming in her honey-colored eyes, her shoulders carrying weight that bent her spine, made her movements careful, guarded, the body language of someone preparing to flee. She was planning to run again. Marcus recognized the signs from his own mirror 3 years ago, from the months after the Chen investigation, when he'd considered leaving St. Catherine's, starting over somewhere no one knew his name or his history. And this time, she wouldn't come back. This time, the running would be permanent, would take her far enough that healing would be impossible, that whatever fragile connection they'd built would shatter beyond repair. The late-night meeting with Dr. Montgomery ran past midnight. Discussions of staffing protocols and budget allocations that could have waited until morning, but filled time neither of them wanted to spend at home. When the chief finally excused herself to take a phone call, Marcus stood to stretch his legs, his attention drifting to the paperwork stacked on her desk awaiting signature. The resignation letter was 3 pages down, Emma's name visible on the header. Marcus's hands were moving before conscious thought could intervene, lifting the document, reading words that felt like physical blows. Dr. Emma Sinclair respectfully requests immediate release from her residency contract at St. Catherine's Medical Center, effective 2 weeks from date of approval, transfer requested to Seattle Grace Hospital, personal reasons necessitating geographic relocation. Seattle, 3,000 miles from Boston, 2,000 miles from here, as far as she could run while remaining within the continental United States. Far enough that Whitmore's influence wouldn't reach. Far enough that Marcus would become a memory, a mistake, a chapter she'd close and never reopen. He stood in Dr. Montgomery's empty office, holding the letter with hands that trembled despite years of surgical training, despite muscle memory that could suture vessels and crack chests without hesitation. Finally understanding what was at stake. Not just a professional partnership. Not just the best resident he'd supervised in a decade. Not just a colleague whose competence matched his own. Emma. The woman who'd made him want to feel again after 3 years of deliberate numbness. Who'd challenged his diagnoses and improved his thinking. Who'd worked beside him with synchronization that transcended training and approached something sacred. Who'd shared her trauma on a rooftop while dawn broke, trusting him with vulnerabilities she'd hidden from everyone else. Who'd shaken in his arms while Whitmore's poison lingered in the supply closet air, letting him hold her despite every instinct screaming to maintain distance. He was about to lose her, not to Morrison or another man who could offer her things Marcus couldn't. Not to different career ambitions or geographic preferences. To fear. To the same cowardice that had ruled his life for 3 years, that had kept him isolated and frozen and half alive, because living fully meant risking destruction. Dr. Montgomery returned, her phone call concluded. Marcus set the letter back on her desk, his decision crystallizing with the clarity that came from finally understanding what mattered, what was worth fighting for, what he'd regret forever if he let slip away without trying. He'd been running for 3 years. Emma had been running longer. And running had saved neither of them, had only delayed the inevitable reckoning with the truth that some things were worth the risk of being destroyed. Marcus stopped running on a Wednesday morning. The decision arrived not as dramatic revelation, but as quiet certainty, the kind that settles in your bones and makes continuing in the wrong direction impossible. He walked into the hospital attorney's office without appointment, without carefully prepared speech, and told the truth he'd been avoiding for months. I have feelings for Dr. Sinclair, romantic feelings. The words felt foreign in his mouth, unpracticed, vulnerable in ways that made his chest tight. But Dr. Whitmore's complaint isn't about protecting residents or maintaining professional standards. It's retaliation, strategic harassment designed to silence anyone who might challenge his behavior. The attorney listened with professional neutrality while Marcus laid out everything. Emma's original complaint in Boston, dismissed despite corroborating witnesses. The supply closet conversation Marcus had witnessed. Whitmore's pattern of standing too close, touching too long, wielding power through subtle intimidation masked as mentorship. Marcus requested formal review, demanded the hospital investigate the investigators' conclusions, pushed back against institutional machinery designed to protect reputation over truth. He contacted Boston General, navigating administrative barriers until he reached residents who'd worked alongside Emma and Whitmore. Gathered statements, carefully documented accounts of behavior that painted disturbing patterns across years. Discovered he wasn't the first attending to complain about Whitmore, just the first to push hard enough to threaten the careful equilibrium of professional courtesy that protected predators wearing prestige like armor. He built his case methodically, approaching it the way he approached complex surgeries, each piece of evidence carefully documented, each witness statement cross-referenced, each timeline verified against hospital records and rotation schedules. The work consumed him, gave focus to fury that had been building since he'd found Emma shaking in the supply closet, since he'd watched fear transform competence into paralysis. Emma learned what Marcus was doing through the hospital grapevine, through whispered conversations and concerned glances, through the way gossip shifted from speculation about inappropriate relationships to speculation about whether Dr. Hale was mounting some kind of crusade. She found him in the east stairwell during his break, the concrete space where they'd first shared vulnerabilities, where honesty had felt possible in ways it hadn't elsewhere. "What are you doing?" Her voice was sharp, edged with something between fury and terror. "You'll destroy your career." "Again? For what? For me?" Marcus looked at her steadily, his expression calm despite the storm he'd deliberately walked into. "Some things are worth the risk. Not me." Emma's words came fast, desperate. "I'm not worth this. I'm not worth you sacrificing everything you've rebuilt." "Yes, you are." The argument that followed was the first time either had raised their voice, months of suppressed emotion finally finding release in the echoing stairwell. Emma accused him of white knight syndrome, of trying to save her to absolve guilt over Chen, of making her into a project that would prove his redemption. Her words were harsh, cutting through his defenses with surgical precision. Marcus accused her of cowardice, of choosing flight over fight because running felt safer than standing ground, of letting fear dictate every decision until her entire life became defined by what she was fleeing rather than what she wanted. His words were equally harsh, equally honest, stripping away the careful politeness they'd maintained even during their most intimate moments. "Why?" Emma's voice broke on the question. "Why are you doing this?" The truth emerged raw, unfiltered by caution or strategic consideration. "Because I'm in love with you." The words hung in the concrete stairwell, echoing off gray walls, impossible to retract. "Because I've been in love with you since week 2 when you challenged my pneumonia diagnosis, and you were right. Because watching you leave will break something in me I won't recover from. Because you're worth fighting for even if you don't believe it, even if you run anyway, even if this destroys everything I have left." Emma stared at him, tears finally falling, streaking, down her face without restraint. "I can't love you. We can't do this." The protest was automatic, protective. The defense mechanism of someone who'd learned love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant destruction. Marcus stepped closer, closing the distance they'd maintained for weeks, his voice gentle despite the intensity burning in his chest. "I know. But I'm done living in fear. I'm done letting my past dictate my future. Whether you stay or go, whether you feel the same or not, I won't regret telling you the truth." Emma kissed him then, desperately, months of suppressed longing breaking free in the collision of lips and breath and tears. Her hands fisted in his white coat, pulling him closer, and he responded with equal desperation, his arms wrapping around her, holding her like she might disappear if he loosened his grip. They broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, the space between them charged with everything they'd been denying. "This doesn't solve anything." Emma's whisper was ragged, honest. "I know." Marcus's reply was equally quiet. "But it's a start." The hearing convened on a Friday morning in the hospital's largest conference room, chairs arranged in formal configuration that spoke of judicial proceeding more than medical review. Marcus sat beside the hospital attorney, his evidence organized in manila folders, his testimony rehearsed but not memorized, his hands steady despite adrenaline making his pulse race. Across the room, Emma sat with her own legal representation, her face composed but pale. Whitmore occupied the center position, flanked by attorneys from Boston General, his expression confident, almost amused, the bearing of a man accustomed to winning. Dr. Montgomery opened the proceedings with clinical precision, outlining the complaint, the investigation's scope, the need for thorough review given the serious nature of allegations from multiple parties. Then she nodded to Marcus. "Dr. Hale, please present your evidence." Marcus stood, his voice steady as he walked the board through documentation gathered over weeks of methodical investigation. 3 former residents from Boston General willing to testify about Whitmore's pattern of harassment, their statements detailed and corroborating, painting picture of behavior spanning years. Documentation of Emma's original complaint, dismissed despite witness accounts. Timeline of events at St. Catherine's showing Whitmore's strategic manipulation, his complaints filed precisely when Marcus began questioning his conduct. Whitmore responded with polished dismissal, his tone reasonable, almost sympathetic. These are accusations from disgruntled residents who couldn't handle demanding standards. Medicine requires thick skin, resilience. Some people mistake high expectations for harassment. He turned his attention to Emma, his smile gentle, devastating. Dr. Sinclair has a history of making dramatic claims when faced with constructive criticism. Her complaint in Boston was thoroughly investigated and found without merit. As for Dr. Hale, his protective behavior toward Dr. Sinclair speaks to inappropriate attachment, not my misconduct. He's defending her because he's romantically involved, which rather proves my original complaint's validity. The words hung in the air, damning in their logic, their careful construction designed to paint Marcus as unreliable witness and Emma as unstable accuser. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Then Emma stood. Her voice emerged clear, unwavering, stripped of the careful qualification she'd used in Boston when she'd apologized for taking their time, when she'd minimized Whitmore's behavior to make it more palatable, more believable. She detailed every incident without softening edges or protecting egos, the touches that lingered on her shoulders, her back, her arms, the comments about her appearance disguised as professional observations, the private meetings where he stood too close, where refusal meant career consequences spelled out through implication rather than explicit threat. The systematic destruction of her reputation when she finally reported him, the way powerful men closed ranks to protect one of their own. Her voice never wavered. She wasn't asking for belief anymore, wasn't pleading her case with the desperation of someone who expected rejection. She was demanding accountability, claiming space that had been denied in Boston, refusing to shrink herself to make powerful men comfortable. The hospital attorney cleared her throat, drawing attention to documentation she'd been reviewing throughout testimony. The board should know we've been conducting our own quiet investigation after Dr. Hale's formal complaint. 3 additional women have come forward, spanning Dr. Whitmore's 20-year career. Their accounts are disturbingly consistent. Pattern of predatory behavior hidden behind reputation and charm, enabled by institutional unwillingness to challenge prominent physicians. The room went silent. Whitmore's confident expression finally cracked, something desperate flickering behind his eyes. The board members leaned together, conferring in whispers Marcus couldn't hear. Dr. Montgomery's face remained neutral, but her hands were clenched on the table before her. Everyone except Dr. Whitmore is excused. The board chair's voice carried finality. We'll reconvene shortly with our decision. Marcus and Emma stood in the hallway outside the conference room, neither speaking, both processing what had just occurred. 2 hours passed, marked by occasional staff walking past with curious glances, by the afternoon sun shifting through windows, by the weight of waiting that felt both endless and too brief. The announcement came via Dr. Montgomery, her expression serious as she emerged from the conference room. Dr. Whitmore's visiting privileges at St. Catherine's are revoked effective immediately. He'll face formal review at Boston General. We're conducting external review of our harassment policies to ensure this doesn't happen again. It's over. Emma's voice sounded stunned, disbelieving. Not quite. Marcus looked at her, seeing past the relief to the question still unanswered. Dr. Montgomery called them back into the conference room. Alone this time, the board members departed, leaving just the three of them in space that suddenly felt intimate despite its size. About your relationship. She looked between them, her gaze measuring. You understand this needs to be addressed. We haven't violated any policies. Marcus's voice was steady, certain. We've maintained appropriate professional boundaries, not yet. Dr. Montgomery's correction was gentle. But you will, given the chance. She paused, her expression softening slightly. St. Catherine's has an exception for disclosed relationships between attendings, provided one partner isn't in the other's direct supervisory chain. Dr. Sinclair, how would you feel about transferring to emergency medicine? Completely out from under trauma surgery's hierarchy? Emma looked at Marcus, then back at the chief. I'd feel relieved. Good. Then I expect formal disclosure paperwork on my desk by Monday. Dr. Montgomery stood, gathering her materials. You've both earned a fresh start. Don't waste it. The hospital cleared them on a Tuesday, the formal investigation concluding with findings that exonerated both Marcus and Emma while condemning Whitmore's pattern of harassment. Emma's transfer to emergency medicine was processed within 48 hours, removing her from trauma surgery's direct hierarchy, placing her alongside Marcus rather than beneath him in the organizational structure. They filed the relationship disclosure paperwork together, sitting in Dr. Montgomery's office, signing forms that made official what had been undeniable for months. The gossip intensified, briefly, burning hot through break rooms and nurses' stations. Did you hear they're actually together, after everything? Some people shook their heads with knowing disapproval. Others smiled, recognizing love when they saw it, despite the messy path it had taken. Within 2 weeks, the hospital moved on to fresh scandals, new dramas, the endless churn of institutional gossip that required constant feeding. But being allowed to be together and knowing how to be together proved entirely different challenges. They were both damaged, both carrying years of learned caution, patterns of self-protection carved so deep they operated below conscious thought. Their first official date was awkward, stilted, both trying too hard to perform normalcy neither felt. Dinner at a restaurant where they couldn't find comfortable conversational rhythm, where every topic felt either too heavy or too trivial, where the absence of medical crisis left them uncertain how to be with each other. They retreated to what they knew. Work became safe territory. Medicine the language they spoke fluently when everything else felt foreign. Coffee before shifts became routine, meeting in the doctor's lounge at 6:45, discussing cases while caffeine worked its necessary magic. Shared meals in the cafeteria, no longer hiding in corners or timing arrivals to avoid overlap. Walking to their cars together in the parking garage, conversations about treatment protocols and diagnostic puzzles, carrying them through space that had once felt charged with unspoken tension. Small touches accumulated, hands brushing becoming deliberate instead of accidental. Marcus's fingers finding Emma's across the cafeteria table. Emma's hand on Marcus's shoulder as she leaned past him to reach a chart. Contact that was simultaneously enormous and utterly mundane, the reclamation of simple human connection they'd both denied themselves for too long. The intimacy progressed in increments measured in weeks rather than days, both of them approaching vulnerability with the caution of people who'd been burned before. Emma came to Marcus's apartment for the first time 6 weeks after the hearing, her eyes taking in the sparse furnishings, the bare walls, the kitchen that held coffee and protein bars and little else. How long have you lived here? 3 years. Marcus heard the judgment implicit in her observation, the recognition that he'd existed in this space without actually inhabiting it, without allowing himself to want anything beyond survival. They sat on his couch, talking until 3 in the morning about everything except the fear that still lived in both of them. the terror that this fragile thing they were building would shatter like everything before it. That happiness was temporary permission that would be revoked without warning. Emma told him about her childhood, about parents who'd divorced when she was 12, about medical school loans that still weighed on her monthly budget. Marcus told her about his brother who'd died in a car accident when Marcus was in residency, about how grief had nearly derailed his training, about learning to function while carrying loss. 2 weeks later, Marcus walked Emma to her apartment door after dinner, their third official date, marginally less awkward than the previous two. He kissed her goodnight, both of them wanting more, neither ready to rush what they were building, both aware that physical intimacy would change things in ways they needed to be prepared for. Emma pulled back, her honey-colored eyes serious in the hallway's fluorescent lighting. "I need you to know something. I'm broken in ways that don't heal completely. I have nightmares about Whitmore. I have panic attacks in supply closets. I'm not the woman you think I am." Marcus touched her face gently, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with tenderness he'd forgotten he was capable of. "I'm broken too. I wake up some nights convinced I'm back in that ethics hearing, defending myself against accusations I can't disprove. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to be honest." Emma studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she must have found, because she took his hand, unlocking her apartment door, pulling him inside. "Come in." They spent the night together finally, and it was tender and careful and real. Two wounded people learning to trust again, learning that intimacy could exist without ownership, that vulnerability didn't always lead to destruction. Marcus held Emma afterward, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder, both of them awake in the darkness, neither speaking, just breathing together in the quiet certainty that this was real, this was worth protecting. This was what they'd both been running from and toward without understanding that sometimes the scariest thing was also the thing you needed most. When dawn painted the windows gray, Emma whispered against his chest. "I'm still scared." "Me too." Marcus's reply was honest, unvarnished. "But I'm more scared of losing this." Emma's arms tightened around him, and they lay together watching light chase away darkness. Two people who'd learned that healing wasn't about becoming unbroken, but about finding someone willing to hold your broken pieces without trying to fix them, without demanding you be anything other than exactly what you were. 3 months passed in the rhythm of shared routines and deliberate building. Emma and Marcus became fixtures at St. Catherine's, the couple that had somehow made it work against impossible odds, their relationship no longer the subject of gossip, but accepted fact, integrated into the hospital's social fabric. They were respected for their clinical skills, admired for resilience that had carried them through investigations and accusations and institutional machinery designed to grind down anyone who challenged it. The trauma team and emergency department developed better protocols from their collaboration, their different perspectives, creating comprehensive approaches that reduced complications and improved outcomes. Life developed routines that felt both foreign and perfectly natural. They traded off whose apartment they stayed at, though Marcus's place slowly gained warmth and personality as Emma left her mark on spaces he'd kept deliberately empty for years. Plants appeared on windowsills, their green leaves requiring care and attention he'd denied himself. Actual food filled the refrigerator, ingredients for meals rather than just protein bars and coffee. Photos materialized on walls, images of them together, of Emma laughing, of Marcus smiling, the first personal items he'd displayed since moving in 3 years ago. Emma's nightmares still came occasionally, Whitmore's voice echoing through her sleep, supply closets transforming into traps, professional competence dissolving into accusations she couldn't defend against. Marcus woke her gently when he felt her body tense beside him, held her until the shaking stopped, never asking for details she wasn't ready to share, never demanding she process trauma on any timeline, but her own. His dark mood still descended sometimes, days when the weight of past mistakes crushed him, when Chen's accusations replayed in his mind with renewed vividness, when he questioned every decision and found himself lacking. Emma sat with him in silence during these episodes, just present, her hand in his, until he could breathe again, until the darkness receded enough that he could function. They worked beautifully together, their complementary skills creating something greater than individual excellence. Marcus's surgical precision paired with Emma's diagnostic intuition, his experience tempering her innovation, her fresh perspective challenging his established patterns. Young residents watched them during procedures, seeing not just clinical excellence but partnership, respect, trust earned through fire rather than granted through proximity. Dr. Derek Morrison approached them in the doctor's lounge one afternoon, his usual confidence replaced by something resembling humility. "I owe you both an apology. My pursuit of Emma was inappropriate, disrespectful. I was seeing what I wanted rather than what was actually there." Marcus accepted with a nod. Emma offered forgiveness that felt genuine despite the discomfort Morrison's attention had caused. Nurse Rachel Torres cornered Emma by the medication dispensary, her expression warm. "I'm glad you stayed. The hospital needs people who fight instead of fold." Emma felt something settle in her chest, acceptance she hadn't realized she'd been seeking. Dr. Montgomery assigned them a joint research project on trauma protocols, official recognition of their collaboration, institutional blessing that carried weight beyond personal approval. They spent evenings reviewing data, debating approaches, building something that would outlast their individual tenures at St. Catherine's. Saturday morning arrived with rare synchronicity, both of them off shift simultaneously, no pages interrupting sleep, no crises demanding immediate attention. Emma woke first, slipping from Marcus's bed with practiced quiet, pulling on his shirt because it was closer than finding her own clothes. She moved through his kitchen, now their kitchen in ways that transcended whose name was on the lease, preparing breakfast with ingredients they'd bought together. Marcus woke to the smell of coffee and cooking eggs, sounds of domesticity he'd denied himself for so long they felt almost dreamlike. He stood in the kitchen doorway, coffee mug in hand, watching Emma move through the space with easy familiarity. Sunlight streamed through windows he'd kept curtained for 3 years, illuminating her honey-colored hair, casting the room in golden warmth that felt like visual metaphor for everything that had changed. Emma looked up, caught him watching, smiled that smile that was only for him now, unguarded and genuine. "What?" "Nothing." Marcus's voice was soft, honest. "I'm just happy." She crossed to him, wrapping her arms around his waist, her head resting against his chest where she could hear his heartbeat. "Me too." It was such a simple moment, utterly ordinary. No dramatic declarations or grand gestures, just two people in a kitchen on a Saturday morning, sharing breakfast and sunlight and the profound comfort of being known completely and loved anyway. That was what made it extraordinary. The ordinariness of it. The fact that they'd survived enough chaos to earn this peace, enough destruction to appreciate this rebuilding, enough loneliness to recognize the gift of companionship. They'd earned ordinary. They'd earned happiness. And standing in the sunlit kitchen, holding each other with coffee growing cold on the counter and eggs probably overcooking on the stove, they both understood that this was what victory looked like. Not dramatic triumph, but quiet contentment. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of someone willing to trace them with gentle fingers and love you more for having survived. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, thick envelope with embossed return address from Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. Emma opened it, standing in Marcus's kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded pages that represented everything she'd dreamed of before Whitmore had systematically destroyed her confidence, her reputation, her belief that she deserved opportunities based on merit rather than appearance or willingness to accept inappropriate attention. Advanced Trauma Surgery Fellowship. 1 year minimum, potentially 2. Training with some of the country's premier surgeons. Research opportunities. The kind of credential that opened doors, that proved you'd survived the most competitive selection processes, that marked you as exceptional rather than merely competent. The letter sat on Marcus's counter for 3 days, visible but unmentioned, its presence growing heavier with each passing hour. Emma would glance at it while making coffee, while preparing dinner, while trying to focus on anything except the decision it represented. She was afraid to want it, afraid of what wanting it might mean. Long distance in a relationship barely 6 months old, still fragile despite its intensity, still learning how to exist without crisis forcing them together. But it was also proof. Proof that her career wasn't ruined. Proof that she could still achieve what she'd set out to do when she'd entered medical school with dreams too big for the people who would later try to contain them. Proof that she was more than the accusations and whispers and institutional failures that had defined the past year. Marcus saw her struggling, saw her trying to gauge his reaction through sidelong glances and carefully neutral comments about New York's trauma program, about fellowship opportunities in general, about nothing and everything simultaneously. He remembered his own choices after Chen, how he'd let fear dictate everything, how he'd almost let that same fear keep him from Emma, how running had never actually saved him from anything except the possibility of happiness. Apply. He said it over breakfast on the 4th day, his voice firm, certain. Emma's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. What? Apply for the fellowship. This is everything you've worked for. But we just... Emma's protest died unfinished, her eyes searching his face for something she couldn't quite name. We'll figure it out, Marcus interrupted before she could build the argument he could see forming. Long distance, frequent visits, whatever it takes. You can't give up your dreams for me. I won't let you. What if we can't make it work? The question emerged small, vulnerable, exposing the fear beneath her hesitation. Then we tried. Marcus reached across the table, taking her hand. But Emma, if you stay just because you're afraid of losing this, you'll resent me eventually. I love you too much to become your regret. Emma applied. The acceptance came 3 weeks later, effusive praise for her qualifications, for her potential, for the contributions she'd make to their program. They had 2 months before she needed to provide final confirmation. 2 months that felt simultaneously endless and terrifyingly brief. Emma found Marcus on the hospital rooftop during a rare overlap in their shifts. The place that had become theirs, where they'd first shared truths about Whitmore and Chen, where vulnerability had felt possible in ways it hadn't elsewhere. She sat beside him without speaking, taking his hand, her fingers interlacing with his with practiced ease. I turned it down. The words emerged quiet, certain. Marcus's head whipped toward her, his expression shocked. What? Why? Because I realized something. Emma kept her gaze on the city spread below them, gathering her thoughts before meeting his eyes. I spent years chasing a dream that someone else defined for me. Prestigious hospital, impressive title, reputation that would prove I belonged despite everyone who said I didn't. But what I actually want is here. The ER at St. Catherine's, teaching residents, building protocols with you. This. Us. I'm not staying because I'm afraid to leave. I'm staying because this is where I want to be. Marcus searched her face, looking for doubt, for sacrifice, for resentment waiting to bloom. You're sure? Completely. Emma's smile was radiant, unguarded. Besides, St. Catherine's just approved my proposal for a new trauma fellowship program. I'll be directing it, building something from scratch, shaping the next generation of trauma surgeons. That's better than any New York fellowship. That's mine in ways training under someone else's program never would be. Marcus pulled her close, relief and pride mingling with love so intense it felt like physical pressure against his ribs. Have I mentioned I love you? Not in the last hour. Emma's reply was muffled against his chest. He remedied that immediately, the words feeling more natural each time he said them. The vulnerability of confession transformed through repetition into simple truth. I love you. Not despite your choices, but because of them. Because you know what you want, and you're brave enough to claim it. They sat together on the rooftop as afternoon shifted toward evening. Two people who'd learned that the best dreams weren't the ones others defined for you, but the ones you built with your own hands, in your own way, with someone who loved you enough to let you go, and loved you more when you chose to stay. 1 year later, spring arrived at St. Catherine's with the promise of renewal, of cycles completing and beginning again. Emma's trauma fellowship program had 3 residents, their reputation growing as word spread about the innovative curriculum she'd developed, the emphasis on both technical excellence and emotional resilience, the understanding that surgeons needed training in humanity as much as anatomy. Marcus had been promoted to Associate Chief of Trauma Surgery, recognition of leadership that had always existed but was finally being formally acknowledged. They'd bought a house together 6 months prior, small but theirs in ways that transcended property ownership. Emma tended the garden with surprising dedication, coaxing flowers from soil that had seemed barren, creating beauty through patient attention. Marcus finally unpacked the medical journals he'd kept in boxes for years, arranging them in the study with care that suggested he was building something permanent, something worth organizing, something that would last. Morning rounds had become their shared ritual, moving through the emergency department with the easy synchronization of long partnership. Emma taught her residents the way Marcus had taught her, with patience and precision, with honest feedback delivered kindly, with the understanding that mistakes were learning opportunities rather than career-ending failures. Marcus watched from across the trauma bay, pride evident in his expression, as Emma guided a nervous first year through a complex procedure, her voice calm, her instructions clear, her presence a steadying force. They were planning a small wedding for June. Nothing elaborate, just closest friends and colleagues gathered to witness what everyone already knew was permanent. Nurse Rachel Torres had agreed to serve as Emma's maid of honor. Her earlier warnings about the Ice King transformed into genuine affection for the couple who'd proven love could survive institutional machinery designed to destroy it. Dr. Montgomery had agreed to officiate, her dry humor and administrative authority making her perfect for the role. It was simple, practical, exactly right for 2 people who'd found each other in chaos and built something solid from broken pieces. A quiet Thursday evening found them at home, both reviewing cases at the kitchen table, comfortable silence broken only by occasional questions or observations. Do you think this presentation is cardiac or respiratory? What's your read? On this CT? The kind of consultation that came naturally after years of working together, after learning to trust each other's judgment as much as their own. Emma looked up from her tablet, her honey-colored eyes thoughtful. Do you ever think about how we started? All the time. Marcus set aside his work, giving her his full attention. I think about the scared woman I almost sent away because I was too afraid to feel anything. About how close I came to losing you before I understood what I had. I wasn't scared. Emma's protest was automatic, reflexive. You were terrified. Marcus crossed to her, pulling her to her feet, his arms wrapping around her waist. We both were. terrified of feeling, of risking, of letting anyone past the walls we'd built so carefully. I'm glad you were too stubborn to leave. Emma's voice was soft, honest. I'm glad you were too stubborn to let me. Marcus kissed her forehead, the gesture familiar, comfortable, weighted with affection earned through shared struggle. They stood together at their kitchen window, looking out at the garden where spring flowers were beginning to bloom, where Emma's patient tending was yielding visible results, where life was asserting itself after winter's dormancy. Two people who'd requested plain, safe, forgettable, who'd tried to protect themselves through isolation and emotional distance, and found instead something worth fighting for. Something neither expected, but both needed desperately. The scars remained. They always would. Emma still had nightmares occasionally, still felt her breath catch in supply closets, still carried Whitmore's poison in ways that surfaced without warning. Marcus still woke some nights convinced he was back in that ethics hearing, still questioned himself with harshness that spoke of wounds incompletely healed. But they'd learned that broken things, carefully mended, could be stronger than they were before. That scars were evidence of survival rather than shame. That love didn't require perfection, just honesty and willingness to hold each other through the difficult moments. Morning arrived with its usual demands. Marcus and Emma drove to St. Catherine's together, their conversation easy, their silences comfortable. They changed into scrubs in adjacent locker rooms, met at the scrub sink for a complex procedure requiring both their skills. Side by side, they scrubbed in with practiced efficiency, movements synchronized through years of partnership, through trust built in crisis and maintained through daily choice. No words were needed, just presence, skill, trust, and love worn comfortable as old scrubs. The trauma bay doors swung open. Marcus looked at Emma. She met his eyes, nodded once. Together they walked through the doors, into the space where they'd first found each other, where they'd built something neither could have built alone. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps during a study break? Please subscribe to our White Coat Tales channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's connect and share our experiences together.